Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, things are going a little bit random. Now, before you switch off, do not worry because they're going random in the company of someone that has been exploring that subject. Matt Ballantine has been on the show before. There's a link to his previous appearance in the show notes. And whenever he appears, there's always fascinating insights that we can learn from. And Matt has recently been looking at the role of randomness in work and life, and in particular, how randomness can be a strategic advantage, particularly when dealing with complex, unpredictable problems that defy traditional solutions. So Matt's been exploring how that can work and has some really practical tips for how we can use randomness to make better decisions. In fact, he engages me unwittingly in an exercise where I talk about my own business and use one of his tools to explore how I can think more creatively about solving some of the challenges I have. This was an absolutely fascinating discussion. So whether you're afraid of the word random or you are open to embracing it, Matt has something for each of you. It is a brilliant discussion. And if you listened to him last time and heard about his 100 Coffees project, of course, I get an update on that. But the main topic of the show is randomness and how it can help us. And I learned a tremendous amount from Matt. So I think you're going to find it super fascinating. It's Matt Ballantine on randomness. Matt, welcome back to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you, Christian. It's a pleasure to be back wherever back might be. It's a bit weird, isn't it, these days with how we work in these virtual ways. Where am I back to?
Well, I think, welcome back, whatever you want to phrase it. But last time you were on the show, we were talking about this wonderful experiment that you were running 100 Coffees. And before we come on to talk about the other things I want to talk about, we obviously owe the listeners a catch-up. How did the 100 Coffees pan out?
The 100 Coffees was really good. So the project, which was based on the hypothesis, and this is an increasingly recurring hypothesis for me, of doing things because something interesting might happen. The idea was to be able to have coffee with 100 people who, some of it was in person, some of it was having it on Zoom calls, and no agenda, meeting for an hour, having conversations with people. And partly it was kind of coming out of the pandemic and the strangeness that we had with not being in person and having our entire lives massively disrupted for 2 years, and then trying to be able to, how do I sort of address some of that? And also, I think increasingly interested in how, because people's diaries have become even more hyper-optimized around the 30-minute interchangeable units of outlook time, actually being able to make space for conversation where you don't know where things are going. So I ended up in 2023 was the year I ran it, and I did about 138 coffees over the course of the year. I met with all sorts of people. About half the people I met in person, about half online. I met with people I hadn't seen for many years. I met somebody who I'd been to university with, who I'd not seen since I graduated back in 1999. And I met lots of people I'd never met before. I met in various different places. I got taken to see the first ever dinosaur exhumed from the ground of the United Kingdom. I went to a graveyard in the city of London, and I sent my dad viral on the internet, which was quite entertaining. Not me, my dad, which was fun. And so, yeah, all sorts of interesting things came out of it. A lot of reflection since. I think a lot of thinking about how hard so many people found it to be able to make space for an hour of conversation without defined output before they did it, because of, this compulsion with having to know what happens before you do things. And that, I think, is a really big issue actually in organizations at the moment. The stuff that used to happen on the periphery and in the liminal spaces between what we thought was the work were actually the important things. And we stripped all of that out because you go from one Zoom meeting to the next Zoom meeting or Teams meeting or whatever else. And the way in which the Protestant work ethic has a huge role to play, even though we've lost our faith, we still have the vestiges of the religion that govern the foundation of the capitalist system, and makes us feel guilty if we're not doing something that we think will take us closer to God or promotion. And so, yeah, loads of things. It was a very interesting experiment, and I'm very glad I did it. And I continue to have coffee with people. I've just stopped thinking of it as a project now. It's just more embedded into my day-to-day work.
We said this last time we talked about it, but it's very typical of your playfulness. And you strike me as being someone that sort of just experiments and let's just see what happens, and is willing to take it's, I mean, it's in a way, you could say it's no risk at all, because it's just an hour of your time. If it goes horribly wrong, it goes, providing you're not finding yourself in a graveyard with someone
With an
who
axe murderer, yeah.
Well, you're right.
Yeah.
Right. Provided you do the basic level of screening,
Yeah.
it's low risk in the sense of you've lost an hour, but it's potentially high reward in terms of where it might take. But I love this contrast between the efficiencies that we're all supposed to have and actually the joy of life and the serendipitous moments. And so I think one of the things I found really fascinating about getting to know you and seeing what you do is that you embrace that. And there's a very R&D approach to your existence that I think lots of other people feel like they can't do, don't know how to do, have lost the ability, because I think we all have it. They've lost the ability to do. And so I love that thread runs through. And so, yeah, it might not work out, but it doesn't matter. That's just a feature.
Yeah. And I think it's playfulness, but not wackiness. I really get quite a knot in my stomach when I see people who are doing wacky stuff in the world of work. That kind of like, no, that's going to make too many people uncomfortable. I think as well, it's low risk, but I also am very keenly aware of the position of privilege that I have, particularly being male, in the idea of meeting up with strangers is a very different thing if you're a man than if it's a woman, I think. And I'm very glad. I think 40% of the people that I met with were women during the course of the experiment. I'm really indebted to them for having the trust in me to be able to do that, because about half of them didn't know me beforehand. And that we should never lose sight of that, because it's actually, risk is not equally distributed across our society. And that's something I've become quite much more aware of in the last 5 or 6 years, I think. But yeah, this idea about being able to be playful, to be able to do things, as I say, this idea is something interesting might happen. If you're not doing anything, you're not going to get anything interesting coming out of it, because just doing the same thing day in, day out ain't going to lead to anything interesting happening.
Speaking of that, what have you been doing since the last time we spoke?
Well, 2024 started with me producing I've got my job. So my day job is I work as an account manager for a software development business called Equal Experts. And I'm indebted to my organization as well, because we operate in a way that is quite unusual. We've got 500 employees. We don't have a single manager. So I don't have a boss to tell me not to do stuff, which is handy. But, that means you have to be able to take accountability and be self-managing. So the stuff that's been happening outside of interesting work with clients, building software and so on, is the start of the year was a thing called the business Meerkat, which is a card deck based on the principles of tarot to be able to help people explore challenging situations, problems, and so on within a business environment. And that's been really interesting. I've got some physical ones made, and there's a digital version of a few digital versions of it as well now. And then that, and just the kind of confluence of various things that I've been doing for many years now, got me thinking about the theme of randomness. And so since the late spring, early summer, with a good friend of mine, Nick Drage, we've been starting to work on a book about randomness and to research into what is randomness, why is this important, and the hypothesis that we're starting to get to as a kind of guiding principle for the book is a lot of the time we are faced with complex problems. And there's a wonderful analogy that was originally coined by the philosopher Karl Popper, who talked about the world being made up of things that are like clocks and things that are like clouds. And things that are like clocks are ultimately knowable. If a clock stops working, you can take it to pieces and you can investigate. And eventually, the more data you gather, the more refined you will get in being able to define what the problem is, and then you can fix it or decide that it's not worth fixing. That's great for clock-like problems. Cloud-like problems, the minute you reach into a cloud, it's changed its shape around you. By investigating it, you are becoming part of it, entwined within it. And there isn't a right answer. You can't in fact, if you gather more and more data, what you tend to find is you get more and more confused. Lots of the time, people try to be able to break cloud-like things down into smaller things to make them simpler, but actually complexity is fractal. And so by breaking it down into smaller things, you get even more complexity, which is not good. And the hypothesis behind the book, I think, is, from the work that we've done so far, when you're faced with these cloud-like complex problems, which essentially are just a series of random events over which you may or may not be able to predict, but you certainly probably will not have any control, maybe randomness itself becomes the strategy you should use to be able to try to plot a course through. Because if you try to treat it like a clock-like problem, you will get confused, you will spend a lot of time doing lots of analysis, and there isn't a right answer. So you just got to, jump in feet first and try to work out how to do it as you do it. And the randomness part of this enables you to be able to break out of what would be your usual answer.
And so is randomness, in the way you're describing it, is that something that can't be predicted or something that we can't predict? In other words, it's beyond human capabilities.
So there's two general definitions of randomness that I've sort of discovered so far through the work. I say that, I've looked in the dictionary. The first is a very mathematical term, which is if I roll a die, a six-sided die, there is an equal chance that the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 will come up top, which means it is random in that the probability of each of those outcomes is equal, so therefore that's randomness. But it's very bounded, because if I throw a six-sided die, I won't get giraffe.
Right.
And that's the other definition, the more popular definition maybe of random, which is, when people go, oh, it's a bit random, isn't it? Often it isn't at all. But in that context, random means something unforeseen or unforeseeable happening. And then I think the other thing that in this reference is kind of clock-like or cloud-like, there's definitely a correlation between clock-like problems and the mathematical definition of randomness. There's only so many parts that could have gone wrong in a clock. But with a cloud-like problem, which I mean, particularly in your field around managing and thinking about risk, I would contend that most problems that involve people are cloud-like problems. And the reason for that is because of our interactions with them. It is not a thing that is independent of what we do. So, for example, we knew that there was a pandemic coming. It was quite obvious to a bunch of different areas of science that there would be a global pandemic and it would be pretty disruptive. If we'd known that the pandemic that happened was going to happen and come out of the lab in Wuhan, that pandemic wouldn't have happened, but that wouldn't have changed the probability of there being a pandemic on the way. So there's things that you can predict, and there are things that you can accurately associate odds to, and some of the things actually you don't even get to that level. So another example of it, we were lucky to spend some time in Japan for a holiday over the summer. And have you ever experienced an earthquake?
Yes.
It's quite weird.
Insane,
Like things that you take for absolute granted, just thrown up in the air. We had a scale 4 earthquake when we were in Hakone. It lasted so short that it was only afterwards we realised what had happened. I'm quite certain that if it happened to my house here in southwest London, then all the plaster would be on the floor. As it was, there were a couple of pictures on the wall that were slightly skew-whiff, but that was it. It was all that. Now, in Japan, they know that there is a megaquake coming, and they can prepare for that. They can put contingency in place. Every public area you go in Japan, you seem to see signs that tell you how far above sea level you are, because actually the danger from megaquake isn't from the earthquake, it's from the tsunami that comes afterwards. And so they've got contingency in place. They know that there's a once in every 150-year quake that is due, but they literally have absolutely no way of being able to work out when that is. And there's a lot of effort going into seismology to try to be able to predict quakes, but it's literally, as it happens, you find out it's happening. So there's stuff where you could say, well, it's just we haven't got the right data to gather to be able to predict, and therefore we could get better at it if we get more data. And then there's stuff which are much more cloud-like problems where actually the more data won't going to help you. You need a different strategy to be able to deal with what's going on when there's that level of complexity.
And the bit my mind went racing to when you sort of said that almost the way that we respond to things involving humans could influence them, I was thinking about traffic, where if you give everybody perfect information about traffic, then they'll all avoid the traffic jams and create another one. And so there's this beautiful thing, I think, and the reason I'm fascinated by this is clearly Mother Nature has some of these dynamics. But if we look at some of the human systems that we operate in, there's often a sort of a presumption that, we'll be really intelligent about how we look at it, but we have to recognize that humans are sentient and they will respond using perhaps data points that we don't want them to use, and they'll respond according to what other people do. And so it becomes a lot more complicated. So I really like this idea of saying, actually, many of the challenges that we're facing now, we have this we more data than ever before, and we'd like to believe that that's a nice way to solve the problem. But actually, as you say, there's a ton of things out there, particularly the behavioral stuff that I'm looking at, where that's a terrible way to look at the world, because it can give us, this data gives this degree of certainty, at least we think there's a degree of certainty, then confidence, that doesn't necessarily help us to solve the problem. And so I really like the fact that you're just unpicking the challenges that we're facing. And I guess what you're saying is it's potentially a little bit more complicated. We need different tools to solve the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So just an example in the sort of traffic world, a very alternative tool to thinking about how you make spaces safer is that there's a movement, it's sometimes called naked streets. And what you do is in urban areas, you just remove all street furniture. So rather than do what we generally do, which is put more and more rules and ways of constricting things and determine the way in which you can tell people who are right or wrong, if you remove all of that, what you do is you force people into micro-negotiation all the time. So there's Exhibition Road in London, the road that runs up towards Hyde Park from South Kensington, and you've got all of the museums on it, and they've removed all street furniture pretty much there. And there are issues for people with this undoubtedly, but for the most part, it makes it a much safer place, because you can't assume that I'm right and therefore it's that cyclist who's wrong, so it was their fault that they got knocked off, because there are no rules. And so you're then in a position where you're having to do this constant micro-negotiation. It's also why, for me, this is the evidence about why self-driving cars are going to be a long way away in urban areas. They might work on motorways. I could see how that could work, but actually once you get off the motorway, I just don't see how that's going to work at scale. The way I've been thinking about it, though, in terms of our perceptions of how this stuff works, is if you think of a continuum, and at one end we have a completely deterministic view of the world, which is I am complete control of everything, and everything that I do or plan will come to fruition. And that's kind of how organizations pretend the world is. And then they get surprised when something unexpected comes up. At the other end, you've got a view of the world which is completely fatalistic, and that it's in the lap of the gods, or shit happens, or whatever it might be, that means that you have no control over, and there's no point in doing that. You just react to everything. And that, again, isn't a particularly useful way of existing. In the spectrum in the middle there, since the work of Thomas Bayes in the 1700s, who essentially invented the idea of complex probabilities, we increasingly have been led to the view that you can predict everything, calculate the odds, and then make rational economic choices on the basis of is something likely to happen or not. And that's great as long as it's a clock-like problem. But for cloud-like problems, particularly when it comes to thinking about what should you do, I'm increasingly of the view that you need to use randomness to be able to break out of the ways in which you might usually think about it. You need to have new input that takes you in different directions, or allows you to take interesting small steps to see if something interesting might happen, that mantra again. And there's a really interesting example of this, which is keeping you alive every day. Okay. So your continued existence on this planet, not just yours, Christian, other people, anybody listening to this as well, dear listener, you as well, that we have these things in our immune system called T cells. They got quite a lot of publicity during the pandemic. T cells basically are organisms within white blood cell structure that will attach to viruses or bacteria that enter our bloodstream and destroy them. And the way they work is that they've got a series of protein things on the outside called receptors. Those receptors have patterns of proteins. I think they're made up of 3 different types of protein. And if the pattern on the receptor matches to the pattern on the virus, it can attach and then destroy it. Now, how do T cells know what are the likely viruses that are going to get into your bloodstream that they need to protect us against? The answer is they can't possibly know, because it's a complex problem. It's a cloud-like problem. So what they do, the receptors go through a regular process called recombination, where they literally shuffle the proteins so that you end up with a new combination which might attach to something. And that's how the T cells protecting us. Now, it's not infallible, and that's why we need things like vaccines, because that boosts the system and means that you've got the right ones in there from the start. But it's been good enough to be able to keep us as a species evolving for, millennia. And that all might seem a little bit, biological. Great. How's that applicable? Well, first of all, I mean, it's not a strategic use of randomness. It's an evolved use of randomness, and evolution itself is, of course, a series of random genetic mutations, some of which are useful, and therefore they win out. But you can draw quite a close parallel to things like, say, the way in which Net works out the best ways to get attention. Netflix, with the thumbnail images and the short bits of text that they use to be able to describe films and programs in their program guide, that's not a designer sitting there coming up with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of little permutations of it. They use randomness just in the same way that the T cell receptors are shuffling themselves, recombining every so often to work out which ones work best. And then from that, they're able to use A/B testing to work out, well, what's Christian likely to like best and what's he going to, click on or not. So they're using a very similar principle of randomness to be able to drive an interaction with the world to see if something interesting might happen and then look at it and then work out what you do next as a result. That, for me, seems to be a really interesting model to then bring into those points where we get stuck, where we can't work out what the road forward is. And sometimes you need to do it because you've got a particular problem at mind now. And sometimes you need to do it because then you've got a bank of other stuff. So, for example, the 100 coffees, there have been elements of what's come out of that in terms of the people that I've met, the things that I learned, the experience of it himself that's informed what I'm doing for the book. And I didn't plan it that way. I just know that if you do a something interesting might happens approach to the world, stuff comes out of it.
I love this, particularly where we're faced with decisions where there isn't a right answer. So we can often kid ourselves, I've made the best possible decision, but we know, to use the medical term, side effects, unintended consequences, however you want to phrase it, the bottom line is there are calls that we make, things we design, processes we go through, where it's not going to be 100% perfect, obviously the right answer. And so I love this idea of moving away from sort of A versus B, and I have to weigh these things up, to thinking, well, actually, let's just inject some other factors. Let's just think about things in a different way, because it's not as if we have the gift of getting a lot of these decisions 100% correct. So what might feel, because what you described there, you could say, if you were sort of a bit nervous, you'd sort of go, well, that sounds like a high risk. I would prefer to stick to what I know.
Mm.
And so what I like about this is you're recognizing the reality of the world, say it's a bit more complicated. So let's not be too scared of getting things wrong, because actually we know that we can't always get it right.
Yeah. And where my thinking is at the moment is that there are 3 criteria that need to be, probably 2, if not all 3 of them, true for this sort of approach to work. The first is it a cloud-like problem rather than a clock-like problem? If it's a clock-like problem, if it's what's 2 plus 2, throwing a dice to work out the answer of what is 2 plus 2 is not a good strategy. Although, ironically, that's exactly what ChatGPT
I was going to say
doing. Okay, which is also, I mean, it's also got me thinking a lot about those technologies and the extent to which people are trying to deploy technologies that I think could be really interesting creative co-partners, and they're deploying them to be able to do clock-like complicated problem answering. And that's just the wrong sort of space for those tools as they stand at the moment, and possibly forever. The second thing is, so after you got, is it a cloud-like problem? The second question is, can you adopt a something interesting might happen hypothesis? Right? Can you go into this not knowing that this will be the right answer, but that it might take you towards something that is a better answer than you have at the moment? And then the third thing is, I mentioned the Protestant work ethic with the coffee stuff. I think that has a big part to play here as well, because the idea of big, serious business people rolling dice or playing with tarot cards as part of the decision-making process is going to freak the hell out of most, let's be honest, because that's not what we do in big, serious business jobs, is it? What we do is we studiously think about stuff and we pore over spreadsheets, and then we basically go to Gartner and ask them what we should do as if they were the Oracle of Delphi. So, we've been doing this nonsense. And let's be blunt, Gartner have no more clue about this than anybody else. Other research organizations are available. they're also winging it as well. So if you can get those three things applied, then I think it's reasonably useful to then start to think about actually using random strategies to be able to come up. And it's not that you just go, oh, let's pick something at random. It's that you use random input to be able to help think around a problem from new ways. The human brain has got this incredible ability to be able to create patterns out of very thin data. So, for example, if you to hold your arm out and you put your thumb up, go on, do it, Christian. I want to see you do this. Right, listen, okay. So you've got your arm out, your thumb up, your thumbnail as you see it at the moment. That's all the detailed visual information that's going into your brain at any given point. Mm-hmm. That's it. The rest of it is being interpreted. We think of our brains as, you can put your arm down now, Christian, that's better.
Thank you.
We think of our brains as being these computing machines because we have a conceit. The Victorians did it. They thought the human body worked like a machine. They had pictures of people like steam engines. We do it. We think our brain is like a computer. It's not like that at all. We have a load of sensory information coming in, and then basically our brains are hallucinating at all times to create what we see as reality around us. And that means that the brain is making connections between stuff in ways that we just don't realize at all. It means we can be fooled. So we can be fooled by optical illusions. Optical illusions, what's going on is the brain is being deliberately tricked by the creator of the illusion to be able to see things that aren't there, to go, oh, isn't that clever? That's just the way the brain works. We can tap into this because actually with a bit of random input coming in when we're confronted with a problem, that huge ability for us to be able to interpret stuff and then make connections and come up with ideas, we can apply in being able to come up with new directions, new strategies, new approaches. So there's a tool I've got which enables you to bring up some random photographs. And I use that with people to be able to say, think about your problem from this perspective. How might you solve it if these pictures were the thing that was helping you to do it? I use them with the tarot cards as well, again, to be able to just have this input in, which enables people to be able to make connections that they wouldn't have otherwise seen, of their thinking. It's not that you're leaving the thinking with the playing cards or the dice or the LLM. You're doing the thinking, but you're having some random stimulus from outside that enables you to be able to make connections quickly that you otherwise wouldn't see.
And therefore unlocking bits of, I guess, the human imagination.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting. One of the phenomenon that I'm talking about in this is a thing called apophenia, which is the ability for us to be able to make these sorts of connections. During the lockdown, I got really fascinated by the foam on top of my coffee cup. We had a lot of time for introspection, and strange things fixated us, and we all thought we were going to die. So there's kind of an interesting conflation of stuff. And anybody says they didn't think they were going to die, in hindsight, it's not true. We all did have that moment of panic for a while. But what I noticed was that on the top of my coffee cup, because I just plonked milk in, and you get these random patterns. And I started seeing them a bit like a Rorschach test. And I started to be fascinated by the thing. What's that? There's a goat and a small Trojan horse and a woodpecker. That's great. Until I set up a Twitter account before Elon ruined it all for everybody, and started to publish the top of my coffee every day to be able to see what they said. And it really is really interesting that, again, if something interesting might happen thing. One of the things that was interesting was some days everybody would see the same thing, and some days people would see completely different things. If you turn a picture of a top of a coffee cup with weird patterns in it 90 degrees, you see completely different things. A number of times there would be wags on the internet that said, I see a cup of coffee. And that's what an image recognition piece of software would do. So well done, you've just failed the Turing test. Although I had quite a few people who said, I am autistic and I can't see anything but a cup of coffee, which is also really interesting about perceptions about what we can see and what we can't, how that works with the brain, and how that factors into neurodivergence as well. So all of these things coming together, exploring this idea of apophenia. And again, it was a thing that I did because I just thought something interesting might happen. It's actually the centre point and the bookends of the talk I'm giving at Manchester Tech Festival later this week is tops of my coffee. Why not?
If I look to sort of what is the randomness here, this is just injecting elements into the thought process.
Yes.
So a stimulus that might prompt us to take our thinking somewhere else. And therefore there's an unpredictable element to that because you're unlocking obviously if it was predictable, that it wouldn't be a random process. So you're bringing in elements that are seemingly unrelated, I guess. If we think about the images that you were talking about or the tarot cards, this is just designed to bring something that you wouldn't normally bring to bear in this situation as a means of jolting the brain into thinking about things differently. It's a factor that it now has to consider.
That's it.
And so it's a different, I guess it's an additional data point that could, I don't want to say blur the existing ones, but if you just sort of looked at numbers on a spreadsheet, you might reach one conclusion. And you're saying, let's bring in a picture or just some other stimulus that's kind of going to, I guess, mess with the existing process a little bit, right? You are disrupting.
Absolutely. And actually, it's interesting. If you look at a spreadsheet, it's easy to spot patterns in there, but that's apophenia going as well. And it's really, it's so common that people will see patterns in numeric data that don't really exist. You draw out a few graphs and you go, oh, we're in a massive growth spurt, or we're in a massive, contraction period. And it's like, no, you don't understand statistics. You don't understand reversion to mean. And there's some fundamentals that are going on because the human brain's really bad at dealing with statistics. Most people do not do it at all well. And that's a really big issue. The other thing though, is I think it's also really powerful when you have people working together to have the random input, because what it does is it forces people into being able to actually being there in the conversation, as opposed to being there just to propose what they think the right answer is. And that, I think, is really powerful. I've used this quite a bit in work in the last couple of years with things like regular health check exercises for some of our engagement teams. I've got a pack of 25 cards with questions on them. But rather than going through a kind of quarterly review, what you do is you have a session where we're going to do 4 cards and we don't know which ones they are, which means that people can't possibly prepare what they are going to say beforehand, because you want them to have the conversation there and then. Can I give you an example of it?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Let's imagine that you are wanting to be able to come up with a bit of a different analysis for a complex, a cloud-like business problem. So let's take a problem that many people will be able to identify with, which is, how do I I'm not getting enough business into my business. How do I get more business? Now, I'm sure your business is very successful, but you're never going to say no to more. And I'm going to use the tarot deck, the business Meerkat cards, to be able to do this. So I don't know if you'll get the sound of shuffling. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, it's very plausible.
Right.
I can confirm he is shuffling cards. But
so, I mean, I obviously tarot has got a lot of preconceptions about mysticism and the occult and spirituality and whatever. I see it just as a random shuffling. But, I like, if you believe in such things, could you tell me when to stop shuffling so that I can make sure your aura is brought into the cards in a way that is suitable to shape what happens next?
Stop.
Okay, stop. So we'll just use 3 cards very quickly. And the cards themselves are basically made up of characters, people, some of them quite obvious, some of them a bit metaphorical, forces and multipliers. So things getting bigger or things getting smaller. So the first card we're going to draw is one that is to express the past. So our problem of not having enough business coming in. And the past, I'll just show you that. And if you just read what it says on that card.
There's the bank manager.
Okay.
There's a picture of a bank.
So why would it be that your problem is an issue from the perspective of the bank manager?
Well, so hasn't actually, this is interesting, really, the real life thing. So firstly, hasn't lent me any money if I needed money to do something. The second thing might well be, and this does become an issue for small businesses, can you take payments from certain jurisdictions or certain people without falling foul of financial crime regulations? And, with my business, because the income flows come from random places, a lot of my payments get held up. Not, I hasten to add, because I'm doing business with North Korea, but sometimes you trigger because it's an unusual business. And so, there are lots of processes that a lot of friction in my world because of bank. I don't need to borrow money, but certainly some of the other processes, ironically, some of the compliance processes that they go through cause me problems.
So there's a kind of historic setting for this problem that might be an issue. So the next card is going to help us explore why it's a specific problem now. Okay, so again, I'll show the card to you. And if you could just describe what you see there.
So I've got 2 sort of fists or gloves or hands, not quite sure which. It says the competitor underneath.
So if you think about the problem of not having enough business at this moment, how would that, from the perspective of the competitor, take that however you want?
Well, that's interesting because I often don't know who my competitors are. And so it's actually very difficult to benchmark. So I would always frame that as very unique offering, unique skill set, unique experience. Nobody quite does what I'm doing. I do genuinely believe that up to a point, but clearly when you're dealing with clients, they will be looking for competitive things. So it's interesting you mentioned this because I sometimes have a look at, there's processes where it becomes a competitive tender. And I say to myself, I don't want to play in competitive tenders because if you're running a competitive tender, it means you're benchmarking me with people that I suspect probably aren't the right benchmark. And if you haven't understood the value that I can add, then it's the wrong comparison group. And I don't have the bandwidth in the company, for one, to participate in competitive tender processes. So what I would conclude from that is that that's a very conscious decision, but it does thwart me slightly in the sense that I exclude myself from lots of things where I'm sure I could do the business and add value because I don't want to get into this competitive thing because I don't think that's going to lead to the best outcomes. But I'm sure I'm leaving value on the table.
And you're obviously working in a field which is about setting up the sorts of processes that you're refusing to engage with as well, but that's another story. Okay, so the final card in this very quick sort of reading is to express what you might do next, okay? And again, if you could just read what you see.
So it looks like it looks like some sort of volcano or some sort of, I don't know. It could be a pile of earth with some sort of sprouting seeds on there. But you've put earth at the bottom of the card, Matt.
So one of the elemental forces. There's fire, water, earth, and air, and that's earth. So thinking about the future, about how you might drive more business, how might you use earth as a trigger to be able to think about what that might look like?
Well, for me, there are two angles I can immediately go for. The first one is thinking about geography and which markets I target. So where are my clients physically based? And that's an interesting question with a lot of digital work. So thinking about different territories, jurisdictions, types of thing. Or the second thing is it points me into environment and sustainability and those sorts of topics. And actually, of course, ironically, they're neatly connected because to get to some of these places may well be to do things that are environmentally unhelpful. So there's the interest. It's almost even in that one thing, I can see some contradiction. So I think that's super interesting. So let's stick with the sustainability line as a way of thinking about it and moving a lot of, because a lot of the work that I do does play into that space. And I do look at, if you want processes to be successful in organizations, they need to be sustainable. Otherwise, it's just a short-term fix.
Yeah. And there you go. That's a 5-minute problem analysis technique where I've used a bit of random input to be able to get you to talk about, a real issue, which is a real issue for any business, about how do you get more business in. And if I'd started off by saying, so how are you going to get more business in? Right. Go on, tell me. Come on, you're the expert. Come on. And that's it. That's it. Just by being able to give that framing, that new lens, we've opened up a whole load of different avenues. And that's in like 5 minutes.
So my thought process is, one, it's because it's my business, so I set the rules. I'm willing to have this discussion on the podcast, right? Where I did actually think about but I could see some people for whom this is quite scary.
Yep.
And so I love the fact that if I think about it in the context of cognitive diversity, get a group of people together and you're almost getting rid of politics in some respects, because there is no right or wrong answer here. And you're taking the agenda to a different point. So that's liberating and really interesting. And I can see how it produces better discussion. It is also bloody terrifying for people who are used to sort of processes where there is a right and a wrong answer, where we look for cues from the senior people. All of that, in many respects, the reason that traditional meetings are often really crap and don't achieve anything except for confirming what was already known and feel like Groundhog Day is because you haven't got these random elements. And yet we cleave to those structures and processes. So this is amazing, but quite terrifying, I guess, for certain people in certain contexts.
No, I'd agree. And so if you remember back to my 3 conditions for being able to do this, the third, can you fight the fear? Can you get over this fear that some people will have? This is too easy. It doesn't feel like work enough. And sometimes you're not going to get over that. So therefore, this isn't appropriate as an approach. But what I've found is that if you can just get a little bit of a hook into this, once you start doing it, people start to see value. And whether that's, the tarot deck is been deliberately designed to look, it's sort of a 1920s kind of feel to it. It looks like some sort of weird historic artifact, but then there's things in it that are obviously contemporary, and it's just all a bit and deliberately so. I made it to look a bit weird, but kind of, tarot deck-like.
Right.
When you're dealing with, say, the random photos, that's a little less out of comfort zone. There's another thing called the Creativator, which is based on a physical device that I built some time ago, and I've now got a digital incarnation of it, which enables people to be able to basically build like a fruit machine, a slot machine of ideas. So you create a series of categories, you populate them, spin the wheels, and then your starting point then is what comes up on the win line. And that, again, is, is quite, well, put it this way, the first run of that, which was with a good friend of mine, Simon White, we did that with a group of engineering consultants who wanted to come up with new business models for being able to sell data into the water industry. Not your immediate, they're going to do some kooky stuff, but because we were able to position it in a way that was safe and people could see the value in. But sometimes you're not going to be able to do that. And I'm completely aware of that. It's interesting though, the other stuff that I've been seeing with these kind of techniques is by externalizing idea generation like this, it becomes something that's out there. And this is something I've kind of noticed with the use of playing cards in business situations for about 10 years now. By having things that are out there that you can point at and you can move around and you can blame somebody else for because it's just, the luck of which cards come up, that's far, far less confrontational than the way in which often the generation of ideas happens within organizations with the politics and the who can shout loudest and the people sticking doggedly to an idea. Starts off by saying, we're going to clear the slate here a bit. Let's not start with who thinks they've got a good idea to solve this. Let's start with some random stuff and then work out what ideas we can generate from that. And it comes back to that idea of it then being a much more collaborative exercise because people are working together and without being able to be held to, preconceptions about what they should know or what they should do or how they should be. But I absolutely acknowledge that for some people, this is a little bit out of comfort zone. I would say though, if those are people who are dealing with complex situations, cloud-like situations, they're not going to be in a good place when it comes to actually dealing with the situation, because if they can't cope with a bit of play, that's bad news.
You made the link earlier to generative AI, because I use that as very much a creative tool, right? Give me 100 ideas on X, or tell me what I haven't spotted, but throw me a curveball or something. Just don't give me a predictable answer. I can work that out for myself eventually. I actually want you to just be a bit silly, right? A bit playful. And so some of the things, so it struck me as I'm looking at what that can do and the sorts of techniques you're talking about, all of this is pushing us into a space where, and I think it's entirely consistent with the idea that for example, in the old days, it was what knowledge do you have? Mm-hmm. Well, that's been destroyed now because we can go look stuff up on the internet.
Absolutely.
And so as I look at that, what value are we adding? Well, it's in that playful, creative space. And so I love this idea that what you're really doing is helping us to say, well, what are humans going to be doing in the future? And so as I look at how do we co-collab things with generative AI, how do we solve problems where there isn't necessarily a right answer? How do we solve big challenges where there's lots of, sort of preconceived ideas or vested interests? The answer is creating structures where we're open to new ideas and are able to express them. And so what I think is fascinating is you're unleashing a number of different processes there. You're unleashing ideas, but you're also unleashing the permission to share them, because the cards have given me permission to take my brain into an interesting space.
Yeah.
In a way that, to your point, like if I said it otherwise, they'd be going, he's an anarchist. What's he doing? Right. But you've created a situation where I'm almost encouraged to do that.
Yeah. And it's the other thing that I've not really got into depth yet, but there's a set of thinking about the way in which we think, which stems from about 15, 20 years ago, that we externalize our thinking. So it's not just I have artifacts that sit around me, and whether that's a pack of cards or whether it's a notebook or whether it's a computer and Google or whatever else. But the history of humanity's interaction with technology of all sorts, much of it has been about being able to help to extend our ability to think by using objects outside. So that means that a notebook, I use a notebook, sometimes a physical one, sometimes a digital one. I very, very rarely will ever refer back to any of the notes in it. But that's not the point of it. The point of it is it's a way of me being able to help process information, and I use the external thing. The fact that we have, outsourced a bit of the brain that for a while we used to store telephone numbers And I can remember the telephone number that we had in our house in Watford Fields in 1973, 42324. It's palindromic as well, so that probably helps. But I can remember our wife's phone number, and that's it. And my own phone number. That's it. I've completely forgotten how to remember phone numbers because I don't need to, because the computer does that thing for me. And actually physical space, which is interesting given where we're at with the debates about in person or not in person and all that stuff in the world of work. But my working space at home is quite chaotic because that's how I need it to be for my brain to work. My wife's is minimalist, and every so often she'll come in and tidy up, and it's like she's kicked me in the head. But I've realized from this theory stuff that actually there's actually more than it's more than just me being grumpy about having tied in it. It's actually because this is how my brain uses the material space around me to be able to do stuff. And part of that for me is I need some random stuff. I have stuff on my desk that I look at occasionally and go, why is that? Oh, that's there because. And again, that's all fulfilling some of the same function.
You used the word earlier, I think I did as well, like childlike. Very, very definitively childlike as opposed to childish.
Absolutely.
This is if I look at what runs through, the sort of threads through all of the things that you're talking about here, it is kind of taking us back to that age when we were allowed to do what the hell we wanted. And, there was no such thing as a bad idea. You would create a piece of art and nobody has a freaking, probably the kid doesn't even know what it is, right? It doesn't matter, right? It's a joyous expression of freedom, of free thinking. And so one of the things I've been struggling with is the way education, but also work, conditions us to certain practices that go completely against the sorts of things that you're talking about. So you have to logically argue things. You're not, unless you work in ad agent, in the right bit of an ad agency,
absolutely,
or a designing role, or you're a performer. You're not really allowed to have this sort of thought. And so I think increasingly, it's what we're going to need people to have. But we haven't really got the wherewithal. And I love the idea that randomness is the entry point there, because I see lots of other examples of a little bit like enforced fun. Let's have some enforced creativity. This will do this. Yeah. And as I was listening to your techniques, I was thinking about lots of so De Bono and his
thinking hats.
Yeah. Right. Now that's great as a way of disrupting things, but that's basically forcing somebody to play a particular role that may or may not play to their strengths, and it may not play to their strengths on the day.
Yeah.
And so what I like about it is all of those things, I don't want to criticize them because there is some good thinking in it, but the constructs that aren't going to get the best out of us necessarily. Possibly better than not doing it. But what I like about yours is you're unleashing completely and just going, there are, back to my favorite word, rules. There are no rules, right? So as the thinking hats there are rules about what role you have to play in that thing. If you get pre-mortem, there is a set of rules about how that operates. What you're introducing is the element of saying, well, don't worry about that. Let's just take this wherever this is going to take you somewhere. And therefore, that seems to me to be much more human and much more powerful than some of these sort of constructs. And I guess I'm thinking back, some of these, maybe the reason you have to have these other constructs is that to step into the Ballantine word is going to be too far. If we can create some sort of construct that sounds like it's based on psychological principles, that's a bit more comforting to people than let's show up with a bunch of toys, which is how you might frame that. But you're really unleashing it, right? So if we looked at those things as halfway houses, this is really taking us full step back to childhood.
To an extent, I think it's also what I was touching on earlier about the preconceptions about how it is that we think. And I think that there's two things within that. The first is the kind of metaphor, the film Inside Out, and that idea that there's, or there was the numbskulls.
I was just
Whizzer and Chips.
I'll try and find links to these and put them in the show notes for anybody that's not of our era. I know exactly what
you know the one I mean. And this idea of the little people in our heads who are able to be able to process the information going on, and that's how we deal with it. And it just doesn't work. It's one of the reasons why I'm pushing against the use of the term hallucination for when LLMs make up stuff that's wrong. They're not hallucinating. The hallucination is a human thing. This is what we do. And sometimes it goes off the rails. And that might be because of illness, or it might be because of recreational pharmaceuticals, or it might be because whatever else. But actually, we're in a controlled hallucination all the time. And being able to tap into better understanding about how our brain works to be able to come up with ideas and the like is partly what is going on.
So as you're researching this, how have you gone about doing that? Is there randomness in the methodology as you research this subject?
Yes, is the short answer. The longer answer, what we've done so far is I started off by putting the hypothesis that a book about randomness might be interesting. What dimensions of randomness do people think would be needed to be covered, as a link out on LinkedIn? And I got a bunch of stuff came back from that. And then I took that list, Nick and I worked on it a bit, and then we fed that list into ChatGPT, and we said, if we were to write a book about randomness, here are some of the things that we think we should consider. What have we missed?
Mm-hmm.
That gave us some stuff, which is randomness generating that, the controlled randomness that happens within LLMs. We then, I can't remember which way around it happened entirely, but I think about at this stage, we then hatched the plan that the book itself, the first chapter and the last chapter should be read first and last, but the chapters in between can be read in any order. And part of what we will write about is creating randomization machines that enable you to be able to create a random order should you so wish to not read it in a linear
Mm-hmm.
form. What that's been interesting for is to be able to create a set of boundaries that means that none of the chapters can heavily reference any other on the assumption that you've read the one before, because there is no order to it. So each of them becomes quite self-contained, which actually I think makes them much more interesting because they are then stories of themselves. We then fed the proposed chapter headings again into GPT and said, what have we missed? It came up with a list of about 9 others. There's 8, first chapter, last chapter, 8 in the middle. We had 6, and then it came up with about 9, but we reckon most of them are covered off apart from 2. So we've got now a chapter list. And there were lots of things that we brainstormed out in terms of things that we knew or were interested in being able to find out or people to talk to. Again, then asked the LLMs about asked for a reading list for each of the chapters. Give me a list of 3 books for each of the chapters. So the 20, however many it was that it came up with, it was 8 threes, 24. There were 2 books that it got muddled, where the author and the title were wrong. But everything else was correct. And actually that led us to a whole bunch of books to read, which are read or reading or got to the third chapter and go, oh, this is dull. The best bit out of that is in the 60s, the Rand Corporation produced a book of 1 million random numbers. And one of the chapters about random numbers, creating the complexity, one of the chapters is about the complexity of generating random numbers. And one of the books recommended for that was a book of 1 million random numbers, which is brilliant because then there's a story behind that. We need to understand how the book was created. And then I'm just starting to ask people and talk about it and searching for people who will come and talk to me. I had a wonderful conversation with my father, which went something along the lines of, oh, Dad, yeah, the latest side project is I'm writing a book about random. Oh, that's interesting. There was a school friend of mine whose dad helped invent Ernie, which was the computer, an analog computer that was built in the 1950s to do the premium bonds, which is a sort of national lottery thing that was set up around it. Oh, that's interesting, Dad. Who was he? Oh, he was Tommy Flowers' son. Now, if you know anything about the history of computing, Tommy Flowers was the man who built Colossus, which was the machine that was co-designed with Alan Turing at Bletchley Park. I said, Dad, why haven't you told me before that you knew Tommy Flowers' son? So that's the sort of random stuff that comes from there. And then conversations, I've got somebody really interested, actually, as to the listeners, anybody who can talk about randomness in sport. So from things like the tossing of coins in football, which mostly is not very important unless it's before a penalty shootout, when it seems from analysis, 60% of the clubs who win the toss for a penalty shootout go on to win the match. But it's not because they shoot first, necessarily. Fascinating stuff. Anybody knows anything about ancient Greek sortition, which is where they use randomness to be able to elect, or not elect, but select people for civic duty? That'd be awesome. And so it's just going like that now. So we've got the chapters, we sort of know what we want to explore within, and next comes a series of conversations with people, and we learn from that, and then that shapes it. And then the aim is to, by the end of the summer, have a kind of first draft of it. And then we're also deliberating around whether we crowdfund or try to find a publisher or I don't know what yet. But yeah, so that's the sort of process as it stands at the moment. I've tried to write a book once before, and Nick has written a book before. So we both have enough of the scars of that to be able to sort of know what we're doing.
I sort of love the idea that you don't quite know how it might pan out, right? So you're open to different forms of publishing. And I was thinking as you were talking about digital version of it, you can read it randomly. I have no idea where the Kindle can accommodate this, but wouldn't it be awesome if you open the digital version and it had just randomly sorted out for you?
Yeah.
So I love all that sort of thinking.
Well, the other conversation that we had last week was whether we could have if we're doing a kind of Kickstarter version of it, will there be a version of it that comes with the individual chapters and a binding kit so you can bind it yourself?
Oh, that's really old school.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's all sorts of ideas that come out of that. And definitely we want to build some random number generators to be able to enable people to be able to select. So the way you will select it will be through things that we have built to be able to do the randomization.
And how has this, you've produced some products and you're writing, how has this changed your approach to life? Now, we know that you're already up for things in the loosest sense of the word.
Yeah.
How has it changed your sort of general perspective? Is there anything you're doing noticeably different that you weren't doing before? Are you looking for more predictability in certain aspects? How's it influencing you?
No, it's really interesting. It's changed my perspective about quite a lot of the way in which the world works. And once you just actually accept that it is a series of random events over which you have only fleeting control, and that therefore you need strategies to be able to deal with that, I think it becomes a lot easier. There was just discussions in the last week about financial performance at work, which I just took a completely different perspective on it from what I would have done a year ago before I started really digging into this. I think there's some really interesting things. One of the chapters will be about things like sortition, this idea about how you select people for civic duty, and starting to ask some really interesting questions as well about the ethics of that. So is it ethical to have, say, members of parliament selected by lottery rather than selected by election? Is that okay or not? Would it be okay for university places to be allocated on the basis of lottery rather than a selection process, or jobs? Or, at what point does this stop being fair? And the answer to that is completely the construct of the culture that's prevailing at the time, because fairness is just a cultural concept. But that, the idea of, not applying for jobs anymore, but you get randomly allocated into a job. Why wouldn't that be fairer than the system that we have at the moment? Might it outperform the system that we have at the moment?
Wow.
So I'm not going to suggest that we start doing any of that stuff, but it's sort of sparked a whole bunch of stuff from the quite mundane through to actually really quite big picture stuff.
But I love that, and the thing I think is really interesting is the joyous element of. I mean, the latter end of it scares the hell out of me because I have visions of me ending up in a job I'd be crap at. Listeners may well think I've.
Well, that would be an improvement.
At least they have an excuse then, right? But I love this. That there is a joyous element to everything that you do, which is this sense of you've let go of, because things are going to be a bit more random, less predictable. There's less of a burden because I guess if you don't frame the world around things you expect to happen and then act with disappointedly when they're not, that it avoids that whole level of disappointment. But it also means you're ready to take advantage of opportunities and see things that perhaps other people might not see. And if I put all of that together, that's quite a good recipe for happiness in many respects. Because if we look at, what drives unhappiness, often it's not, okay, sure, there's people with illnesses and those sorts of things, right? But a lot of it is just, the world isn't turning out the way I expected it to be, or the way I was told it would be, and so we have this disconnect between our expectations of what reality will deliver and what it actually does deliver. And I think what you're proposing is quite interesting because it basically says stop thinking in those terms because that's not how the world works.
Yeah, absolutely. So since Bayes did his thing with complex statistical analysis, it's all gone downhill, quite frankly. And I paid a visit to his graveyard a few weeks ago because he's buried in kind of Farringdon area of London, which is where he's spent most of his life. Very unimpressive grave, quite frankly.
The bit that I love, Matt, is that, that happens to be near where you work, right? But you would do this anyway. This is what I mean. Right. As long as it wasn't too ridiculous, you'd be on that mission.
Yeah.
So you've never been in the back of beyond, right? You want to do this because, well, what's the worst that could happen? Right? Something interesting
might happen, exactly. And I think that there's a lot of cultural and political pressure that we have the answers to everything and everybody wants to know what the answers are. And it's so disingenuous. And something for many years, when I was working at Microsoft, my very ill-fated short career at Microsoft, and I did some presentations at a big event, which was about the future of technology. And I did this talk, which I thought was quite good, but it starts off by saying, I don't know what the future of technology is. I know from Microsoft, it doesn't make any difference. the future of technology is whatever you do to make it happen. And I could see I'd lost half the audience at that point because it meant they had to take responsibility for stuff, you know? But that's the thing. We shape the world around us, the impact that we have in everything that we do, the people we interact with, the decisions we make, the decisions we don't make. But if you frame that in a way that says, look, there's stuff over which you've got control and there is stuff that you don't, but it isn't just then ignore the stuff you have no control over. It's about what do you do to be able to shape yourself, to be able to react to that as best you can and be adaptable and be able to change and to be able to think differently about it, take advantage of it when you can and not when you can't. And that is so in the face of this very deterministic prevailing business culture that we have, certainly in the West, certainly in the, American influence countries at the moment, which seems to think, and again, it's sort of technology industry has had something, the information technology industry, I think, has had a factor in this because we continue to propagate the myth that we will have machines that will predict the future. It's happening again with all this LLM stuff. And they don't predict the future. All they can do is extrapolate the past. And that's great as long as the future is the same as the past, but that isn't how it works. And you can't predict the future based on past performance in a way that will give everything cover, it won't cover all the bases. There's some stuff that you can. If it's raining tomorrow, or if it's raining today, there's a likelihood it's going to be raining tomorrow. You can predict that sort of stuff, and that's useful. It's changed, transformed farming, for example. But even that stuff's getting more and more chaotic now. As we've seen these horrendous things in Spain recently. We need to be able to be adaptive. And maybe randomness is a way in which we can hook into that.
I love that. As ever, time with you has just flown. I could keep talking forever, and we will doubtless have future conversations. But I'll put links to your websites and all those sorts of things in the show notes, so that, and particularly if anybody can answer or have any input on those subjects that you were talking
or
about,
anything else that's if this is sparking ideas and that you think, oh, we should have a chat with Matt about that. Please do. Please get in touch because I would love to extend out the scope of the people I talk to around this. And there's lots of stuff that we've thought about, but there's also everything else that we haven't yet. So I'm keen for suggestions for what that everything else should be.
And I should point out to people that you sell packs of cards, right? So you've had some of these things designed. So if people are interested in those are available. I have a pack of one of your early ones, and they're what I love about it is again, you haven't just created sort of prototype things. There's a joy in you want to produce something that's really nice to hold. So I think you said that the people that make your cards is like one of the top card manufacturers in the world.
Piedmont in Italy, yes. And yeah, I think there's a few packs of the Meerkat. I only did a run of 60 of those, and I think I've only got about 10 packs of those left now. There are some of the play cards, which was an earlier thing that looked at a framework for thinking about how one becomes more playful. And there's a still box load of those somewhere. So. And the other thing, and I'll share the links with you, are these 3 online apps that we've built, which is the Random Photos app, the Creativator app, and the Business Meerkat. Does that 3-card draw that we did. There's a web page you can go and you can just press a button and it will draw 3 cards for you, so you can have a play around with those. And that's it. Have a play.
Amazing. Wow. Thank you for what you do, because I love it. And it's not just what you do, Matt. It's the way you do it and the way you talk about it and the openness to encourage. And you're one of those people that I just kind of, whenever you put something out there, it's going to be interesting on some level and just different. And so I'm delighted to be able to share that and benefit from your thinking. So wherever you take your stuff, there's a ton of us that just look at what you do and look at not just what you discover, but also the way in which you go about it is truly inspiring. So I want to thank you for that. But above all, thank you so much for being, once again, a fabulous guest on the show.
Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to Matt for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Matt, the work that he does, his exploration of randomness, his 100 Coffees project, and a load of other things that we talked about in the show, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. And to discover some of the over 300 episodes of the show, you can visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcasts.com. I will be back very soon, or potentially taking Matt's spirit of randomness. Who knows? It may be a little bit longer, but either way, the show will be back, and I'll have some more amazing guests for you. But in the meantime, stay safe. See if randomness is something you can bring into your life. And thank you so much for listening.